I got a simple, straightforward, and fundamental question from the audience, and it's a question I have not seen or heard answered already on the internet. So let's tackle it in a relatively short video here. I was asked, vegan to vegan, honestly, sincerely, when these people go back to eating meat, these people having been vegan for many years, having been committed to the vegan cause, morally, ethically, ecologically, when they go back to eating meat, so many of them experience these transformative effects, whether that's in their sex drive, in their sense of physical strength and vitality, whether it is psychological or physiological. We now have a pretty large sample size. We have a significant amount of anecdotal evidence of people feeling that it's a revelation and a transformation. They feel tremendously energized. They feel some kind of effect when, after being committed to veganism, they go back to being carnivores, whatever you want to say. Why is this? This is in one of the most heavily observed, heavily discussed, heavily researched areas of social anthropology. Okay? It's because they're engaging in boundary-pushing behavior. It's because they're engaging in taboo-violating behavior. Now, not everybody is like this. I myself am completely alien to this experience of human nature. But if you just start reading the autobiographies of historical figures, it doesn't really matter if they're like politicians or actors or actresses, you will see there is an incredibly common pattern in human psychology, which was like when they were growing up as teenagers, they tried to have sex with their boyfriend or girlfriend in the backseat of a car. And the whole time they'd be terrified that their parents would find them or their older brother would find them, that they'd be discovered, that they'd be caught. And then they remained fascinated and excited by this for the rest of their lives. They became a fetishist for having sex in the backseat of a car. And it just stays with them. There are white people who grow up with a racist family in the American South. And their whole life, they have this fascination with being a white person, having sex with black people, because it was taboo, because it was forbidden, because they're crossing a line, because they're engaging in boundary-pushing behavior. There is a very clear psychological dimension to someone who adhered to and believed in and promoted a vegan diet. Someone who either believed in this as a form of self-abnegation, like they may have thought of it as a kind of monastic vow. They may have thought of it in terms of personal purity. They may have thought of it in terms of a moral mission to change the world, like an externalized mission, where it's not about their self-improvement, but about improving the world. They may have thought of it in terms of a humble service to help animals, the suffering of animals. However it was they thought of it, it is ultimately a self-evident kink, fetish, boundary-pushing, moral precept-violating behavior that they get a thrill out of when they then return to eating meat. And the psychological dimension of this, I think, is transparent and it's demonstrable because all of these people can remember what it was like eating meat when they were just a kid growing up with their parents before they'd adopted veganism, and it didn't have any of these effects on them. Like, some of these examples, they've now become like memes on the internet. Everyone's making fun of them. Oh, I ate fish for the first time in 10 years, and wow, I had this, amazing transformation in my libido, my sex drive. It often is the sex drive. Do you notice that? Both male and female. We've had several reports of this, right? Well, again, I'm sorry. This is one of the most studied, most talked about things in anthropology. Talk about kind of, boundary pushing and, liminal zones of morality and so on. So liminal, meaning on the limits of morality. I remember I even once read it can be any boundary that people are raised to not cross. Or in this case, what's maybe a little bit more interesting is that it was a boundary that they probably adopted, maybe as teenagers, but maybe in their early 20s. It probably wasn't a moral precept they grew up with or that was enforced on them by outside authorities. So they believed in themselves. But maybe that makes, frankly, the erotic effect of transgressing that boundary all the more thrilling and all the more satisfying. So look, I'll use two examples from opposite sides of the globe. I knew a guy who was a boxer, And I forget how far he took it. I think he was in the training camps to be on the Olympic team for boxing. Like he was somewhat serious. He was not a world champion boxer. But, he was training seriously for boxing at whatever level. And, he knew I was vegan. We talked about vegan ethics. And he described to me the scene of him going to a farm, wasn't even really a slaughterhouse, with a group of other, young men training to be boxers, to drink the blood of a horse, like a horse that was to be killed that day. You can imagine, this is like a fucking Stone Age ritual. I mean, this is, let's take it back to experiences people had 10,000 years ago, And, everyone doing this ritual, this was legal, by the way. I mean, it's the same thing. People eat meat. This wasn't illegal. This was in France. This is a white man in France. This is in Western civilization. And, they went and they each had a cup. And you can imagine they're young guys who are in some ways nervous and in some ways maybe cocky and proud. And, they stand around and you watch this animal die. And, of course, if you hadn't used your imagination, the blood comes out of the animal hot and thick. And of course, it's disgusting if you let yourself be disgusted. But they want to seem tough. They don't want to vomit. It's like probably if you can remember being a teenager and drinking vodka or drinking whiskey for the first time and it doesn't taste good, you're not used to it or something. You can imagine there were a lot of psychological elements to this. And this guy told me absolutely, like with conviction, that he got some kind of boost in strength and energy out of drinking, horse blood. And as I recall, he did it again. I don't know how many times, but on another occasion, it was just cow blood. It was a slaughterhouse for cows, and getting the hot blood. So him and this group of athletes, it was something not unknown within the subculture of boxers. Now you can do a chemical analysis and say, okay, what is actually in horse blood? Fat, salt, water. I mean, there are some things you can be reacting to there. There's some level of chemical effect. But primarily, just this whole scenario, the whole setup, it's obvious what kind of effect it's going to have on you. And it's going to have a lot of the quality, frankly, of some kind of dark satanic ritual. There's going to be a sense of fear of death, seeing blood, seeing this animal dead, the smell. If you guys as vegan activists have been to animal slaughterhouses, there's the smell of the animals. They stink already. But, there's the smell of death in the air. It's probably that alone. That even if you don't feel afraid consciously, you're probably reacting to that and feeling keyed up and so on. And then you drink this hot, salty beverage. And, I read another account. I mentioned it in another video briefly of a young man who was fighting in the civil war in northern Myanmar. And he went out, and in very bizarre circumstances, he was rescued basically by a tribe of local people still living in tribal conditions, whatever you want to say. Local people living in very simple traditional conditions. And to help him and the other guys with him, they strung up a goat and slit its throat and offered him hot goat blood. And I mean, he was somewhat starving at the time. And he didn't describe it positively. He felt really disgusted by it. He didn't want to shame the people who did this ritual for him because they're trying to help him back from, he was to some extent dehydrated and starving. And, he didn't want to insult his host kind of thing. But he described how revolting it was, and then he felt kind of dizzy and weird and awful after drinking this. If you just drink salt water, if you drink salt water from the ocean, you can feel pretty weird. So I also don't know if just the salt content is part of the psychoactive effect of drinking a significant quantity of blood. I don't know. Okay, so yeah, there are exactly two dimensions to this story. On the one hand, there's a kind of physiological, medical, nutritional reality of what's in the blood you're drinking or the meat you're eating. That's not that complex. That's a pretty short, shallow story. Like, guess what? If you eat eggs, you get a ton of fat and a ton of cholesterol and not much else. There's not a lot of food value in eggs. If you suddenly start eating red meat, you get a ton of salt, a ton of protein, a ton of fat, cholesterol, and other stuff that's bad for you. It's going to have some effect on you, but having a vegan protein shake, I feel a little bit of a boost after drinking a vegan protein shake because I'm getting some nutrients. If you just drink something that's full of sugar, you can get a boost from the sugar and caffeine and so on. That side is pretty shallow and pretty straightforward. But, here on YouTube, most people really play it cool. I think you're kind of underestimating how much veganism meant to these same people. And look, I use the same verbiage. You can call them fake vegans. You can call them insincere. You can say they were never really activists or never really cared about ecology or whatever. All that's doubtless true. All that and more. They're probably terrible people. But for a lot of these people, veganism was one of the most meaningful things they had in their life. Give a great example. Charles Marlow. Complete idiot. Complete scumbag. Former heroin addict, junkie, by his own admission, by the way. I'm not making any allegations here. I can remember him talking to me and him saying to me in a very honest, down-to-earth way that when he found veganism, he was really searching for something. He wanted something more meaningful in his life. And, not conventional religion. He wanted a sense of meaning, a sense of direction, a sense of moral purpose. And veganism gave him those things. And veganism gives you a self-discipline. For many people, a sense of personal purity. Again, but even just that one word, mission, a sense of mission, sense of direction. That means a lot to people. And then by that same token, violating that, pushing the boundaries, going beyond it, wallowing in your own filth, violating the laws of purity that you take for yourself, that is going to have, for a lot of people, some kind of psychologically thrilling element. So look, guys, I've mentioned on this channel before, a relatively long time ago, I do not experience jealousy. I do not experience any kind of thrill in violating boundaries for the sake of violating boundaries. It doesn't turn me on. It does nothing for me. I mean, all this, there are people who grow up in the Catholic Church, and then they have fantasies about, having sex on the horrible wooden benches in the church, and it's precisely because it's forbidden. Melissa had a friend, a female friend, and she was tempted by this guy, and she admitted, she said to Melissa, but you know what the worst thing is? She said, I know I only want this guy because it's forbidden, because I'm not allowed to be with him. She met him in a workplace scenario. There were various reasons why it was forbidden love. Oh, what I remember saying, okay, now she's got problems. Now that's something you can never satisfy. There are people for whom the forbidden and violating the law is something very exciting. There must be some people who just grow out of it. You tell me, what is sexy about a pair of handcuffs? Really think about that. I mean, the pathetic thing about human nature is that a huge percentage of us, I don't know if it's 30%, 40%, 60%, look at a pair of handcuffs and get turned on because people want to be restrained, people want to be beaten and humiliated, and I know. When I was a teenager, when I didn't even know when I was 17, there were fully grown women who wanted me to do this stuff to them. There were girls my age too. There were women around who thought, "Oh wow, this is some kind of tall, self-confident guy who can, in terms of what people get turned on by and what they get fascinated by, the human mind creates these divisions and boundaries, creates the division between black and white, between, Christian and Jew, between, whatever you want to say, Jew and Gentile. I had one ex-girlfriend, and she grew up Christian enough that it was a little bit thrilling for her. It was a little bit kinky, just my Jewishness. I don't think of myself that way. I don't think of myself as exotic. From her perspective, that was exotic. That was thrilling. There was some first-person testimony from a privileged vegan, another vegan YouTuber here, and she talked about how before she became vegan, just because she grew up with the idea that deep-fried chicken wings were for men, that it was thrilling for her to wear a leather jacket and eat greasy, unhealthy chicken wings out of a bucket. She was doing something that a blue-collar man would do and not something a refined, erudite, a woman would do, like gender roles and social class roles. The sense of violating a boundary. She felt thrilled by this. She felt proud and powerful by this. So, people want to violate boundaries, and they experience it, I think that is the purest word, as a thrill. It's not taking the peach out of the orchard. It's knowing that you're climbing over a fence and stealing a peach, and that you have to scramble to get back over the fence as quickly as possible, and there's an attack dog coming from you. That is the bleak and brutal reality of what human beings want. And yet most people are too lazy and too self-indulgent, and they don't actually get out of their chair and take real risks in the real world. They don't do some of the crazy things I do. They don't go to do humanitarian work on the border between Laos and Myanmar and have people threatening to kill them. They don't have these kinds of they don't take meaningful risks in their life. They want to take meaningless risks. So I guess you can say, in a phrase, this is the psychology of the roller coaster ride. But most people, before they get into the roller coaster, they put on their safety belts.